Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Spooky season is finally here, and I couldn't be more excited. This is hands down my favorite time of the year, and it always gives me that extra motivation to put these videos together. In this one, we're diving into 3 stories of people who ventured into the mountains and forests during this season, only to realize something was very, very wrong. From people stumbling onto something sinister inside remote cabins, to others being attacked by complete psychopaths, and finally, a group of teenagers who went camping in one of these isolated areas, and ended up being stalked by something they still can't explain, even 15 years later. If you've got any suggestions, make sure to drop them in the comments. And also, I've noticed some of you have been sharing where you're watching from, which has been super fun to see. So if you feel comfortable, let us know down below where in the world you're tuning in from. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened in 2017. At the time, we didn't tell anyone except friends, family, and the police. First, because we didn't really know what we had found, and then because we hadn't heard of other similar cases. But last night I was scrolling on Instagram and saw a reel of some girls who had rented an Airbnb or some cabin, and they had found something exactly like what we did. In that moment, I felt like I was back in that cabin again. As you can imagine, I didn't sleep, and I decided I would share this story. Maybe what we went through is more common than I realized at the time, and maybe it can help other people notice the signs and avoid serious problems. It was the first weekend of October when my girlfriend and I drove down to the Smoky Mountains. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that sharp chill that meant summer was finally over. I say finally because I hate summer. I hate the excessive heat and the feeling of constantly sweating. That's also why we always take our vacations around this time of year. We had rented this small cabin off a rental site, tucked way back off a dirt road that felt like it kept winding forever. We had the option of other cabins, but since we didn't have much experience being so isolated in the middle of the woods, at least this cabin allowed us to park the car right next to it. If something happened and we had to leave quickly, the car was right there. So when we finally pulled up, the place looked perfect. Wooden siding, a little front porch, no neighbors in sight. Just the kind of quiet we thought we wanted. The cabin was in perfect condition, as if it had been renovated recently, which was obviously a plus. The first evening was peaceful. We unpacked, cooked a quick dinner, and turned in early. I've always slept well anywhere, even if it wasn't my own bed, so I expected the night to be peaceful too. But at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with this sudden jolt, like something had pulled me out of sleep. This is extremely rare for me. So I just lay there for a few seconds trying to understand why I had woken up so suddenly. The room was pitch black, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I felt this kind of chill, as if my body was reacting to something my mind couldn't process. I wish I could explain the sensation better, but that's the closest I can get to describing it. It felt like it was my body reacting, not my brain. I lay there listening, barely breathing, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the occasional creak of the old wood and the wind outside. Besides, it was ridiculous to think we weren't alone. The cabin was isolated, and all the doors and windows had been locked securely. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the kind of nerves that come with being in a new place, and drifted back to sleep. I had no intention of telling my wife anything. There was no reason to make her uncomfortable with something that was probably just in my head. But as soon as we woke up, I could tell she felt strange. She's always been more restless in her sleep, often has nightmares or insomnia. I figured she probably just hadn't slept well, and asked her what was wrong. She hesitated, clearly not wanting to ruin the trip. She just said it was nothing serious. She'd had a nightmare. I asked her what it was about, because I once read that people with too many nightmares sometimes need to talk about them to process them better. But what she said next drained every drop of blood from my body. She said she had dreamed that someone was there with us, watching us sleep. That she had woken up in the night and seen someone sitting in the chair in the room. She must have seen the panic on my face because she quickly stopped, gave a little laugh and said not to worry. It was just a nightmare. I just smiled back because I was incapable of saying anything. We had a chair in the corner of the room that had made me uncomfortable from the start. Why would there be a chair placed in the corner, pointed directly at the bed? And it wasn't even a comfortable reading chair, just a regular chair. I kept listening to her talk about our plans for the day, but I couldn't process anything beyond the feeling that us both sensing the same thing wasn't a coincidence. Still, I didn't want to ruin the trip. Didn't want to be dramatic or scare her when the only evidence I had that something was wrong was a feeling. So I tried to forget about it and enjoy the day. We went on a hike that ended up being really demanding. It had rained the day before, and the ground was muddy in some spots. That made us slower and more careful. Plus, we got lost, which added 2 more hours to the hike. By the time we got back to the cabin at the end of the day, we were both exhausted. We had slept badly the night before, and it had been a tough day. We just ate one of the snacks we had brought, locked all the doors and windows, and went to bed. I was so tired I didn't even have the energy to think about what had happened the night before. Luckily, that night I didn't wake up. My wife said the same thing. We were both so tired we just crashed. Since we'd had a good night's rest, I woke up in a better mood, glad I hadn't made a fuss the night before. It was probably just in my head anyway. But when I went to get something from the car, I discovered the front door was unlocked. Not just cracked open, but completely unlocked. Impossible. I was absolutely certain I had locked it. That was something we wouldn't have been careless about, especially not in the middle of nowhere and in a house that wasn't ours. I knew we had locked that door. I asked my wife if she had gotten up for some reason and gone outside. She said no, and that's when we both knew something was going on. She admitted she had also felt like it hadn't just been a dream, but she hadn't wanted to scare me. We sat down in the kitchen to talk while having breakfast. That's when she noticed something strange in the kitchen. Something neither of us had seen before. Right by the counter where the sink was, there was this thin, vertical crack. At first, it just looked like a split in the wood paneling. But when we looked closer, it was too straight. The line started near the floor and went all the way up to the ceiling. We pressed against it, and it gave just a little, like there was something behind it. With more effort, dragging it toward us as if it were a fixed piece of furniture, it shifted, and suddenly, we were staring at a narrow opening with a door. Inside, a set of steep wooden steps led down into darkness. We stood there frozen, trying to make sense of it. Finally, we took out our phone flashlights and pointed them down. At the bottom was a small, windowless room. In one corner lay a dirty old mattress. Next to it was a bucket. That was it. The sight was so simple, but it made my stomach drop. Whoever had been staying down there hadn't needed much. Just a place to sleep and a way to relieve themselves. And suddenly, the first night of feeling watched, all the little signs we had brushed off, they slammed together in my head. Someone had been living there. My wife hadn't just dreamed it, and I hadn't just imagined it. What we had felt was real. We shut the panel as fast as we could and didn't even talk about it. We both knew. Whatever had been going on in that cabin, we weren't about to stick around to find out if the person was coming back. We threw our stuff together, barely caring what we left behind, and were on the road in less than 10 minutes. The whole drive back, we talked about exactly what we had felt, what she had seen and thought was just a dream. Of course, we reported it to the owner. He gave us a refund without much fuss, which was a huge red flag that he didn't want trouble with us. He wanted to sweep it under the rug. I thought about leaving it there, but my wife said we couldn't let other people be tricked, so we called the police. Good thing we did. The owner wasn't convicted of anything, at least not that we know of. But the cabin stopped being rented. From time to time, I still check to see if it shows up on listings again, but I've never seen it since. I was 27 when this happened, about 2 years ago now. I'd been working remotely for a while and thought it would be nice to get out of town and rent a cabin somewhere quiet to write and decompress. I found this tiny listing on an obscure cabin rental site. A one-room hunting cabin at the edge of the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee. When I say obscure, I don't mean it in the way you're probably thinking. At the time I decided to rent the cabin, the site seemed normal to me. Sure, it was a bit rustic, but there was nothing major that worried me. The obscure part is something I only realized later, after everything that happened. The photos were beautiful, but grainy, and the description said, very secluded, 4 miles from nearest road access. That should have been a red flag for someone with 0 survival skills in the forest, but at the time, it sounded perfect. I should say that when everything happened, I wasn't in the best mental state. And probably because of that, I made so many stupid decisions in a row. It was late October. The leaves were peak orange and red, and the air was crisp. I packed my laptop, some food, and a couple of books, and drove out there. Leaving my car at a small gravel pull-off and hiking the 4 miles in on a narrow, overgrown path. The cabin itself sat on a ridge called Spruce Ledge, surrounded by trees so dense you couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. No cell service at all, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive back down the mountain. Inside, the cabin was rustic but cozy. One main room with a wood stove, a cot, and a little kitchenette. There was an old, creaky outhouse about 20 yards out back. It smelled of pine needles and cold earth, a smell that had always relaxed me and made me feel like I was part of something bigger. The first day went great. I had just arrived, and my spirits were still high. I chopped some wood, lit the stove, and spent the evening reading. Around dusk, I went outside to take some photos of the sunset spilling over the hills. The woods were dead quiet, except for a few birds calling far off. Later, as it got dark, I thought I heard what sounded like something moving through the leaves way down the slope. I grabbed the camera I had brought with me, opened the window, and positioned myself to try to catch the best angle. But no matter how hard I looked at the trees, I couldn't see anything. At a certain point, the sound grew louder, and I could swear they were footsteps. I shut the window and stayed inside. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't going to be one of those people who immediately panicked just because someone else might be around. As long as I stayed inside the cabin and the person didn't come too close, everything would be fine. I threw another log on the fire and went back to my book. That night, lying on the couch, I could hear the wind rattling the branches. It was clearly going to be a turbulent night in the forest. The cabin walls were thin enough that every sound outside came through. At one point, maybe around 1 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of something metallic clinking. It wasn't loud, just a subtle, deliberate sound, like someone fiddling with the latch on the door. I lifted my head slightly, trying to position myself to better understand what that sound was. But as soon as I did, it stopped. I thought to myself that the wind must have been hitting some metal structure, and that's why the noise was intermittent. I must have fallen back asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up with sunlight hitting my face. I got up, walked a bit around the cabin to stretch my legs, made coffee on my little camp stove, and sat on the porch writing. By late afternoon, though, I had the slight impression of being watched. And when I looked at the trees to my right, I saw that someone was standing in the middle of the trees watching me. I stood up and waved, trying to figure out if the man had just arrived there, or if he had been watching me the whole time. When he didn't wave back, I called out and started walking toward him. That's when he stepped out from the trees, and I could see that he had something hanging from his hand. The way he was walking was threatening, as if he was going to use whatever he was holding against me. Obviously, I started backing up, and that's when I saw he was holding a scythe. I ran inside the cabin and locked myself in. When I peeked out the window, I saw he was already practically on top of the cabin. As soon as he saw me looking out the window, he just smiled and then dragged the scythe across his neck. I knew immediately that was a direct threat. I had no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but from his face and his movements, I knew he was completely out of his mind. I shouted that I was armed and that I had no problem using the weapon. I'm sure he heard what I said. The cabin had thin walls, but he didn't even react. He didn't smile again or make any more moves. He just stayed there. I was doing my best to stay calm, to be rational. But at this point, I was already panicking. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. I was in the middle of nowhere, with my car super far away. I had no way to call for help, and there was a psychopath threatening me outside the cabin. And even though the doors and windows were closed, I didn't know how long the walls would hold if he decided he wanted to come in. I closed all the shutters on the windows, so there was no visibility inside the cabin. And then I started thinking about every possible scenario. I needed to get out of there as fast as possible and run toward the car. The man was probably much more familiar with that forest than I was, so if I wanted to get out, I had to head straight for the car without making mistakes. I gathered all the objects I could find in the cabin, especially the ones that were sharp or big enough to defend myself. At this point, it was already night, and I didn't know if it would be a good idea to venture out into the forest in the middle of the night. So I decided I would wait until morning and then run for my life. Yes, it would be easier for him to see me, but it would also be easier for me to see him, and far harder for me to get lost. The last thing I wanted was to be completely lost in the middle of the forest at night with a murderous lunatic after me. I thought about sleeping, but the fear of him breaking into the cabin and me being completely vulnerable terrified me. At this point, I was also prepared to leave everything behind and take only the absolutely essential things to survive in case I didn't make it quickly to the car. And then, I heard a sort of scream coming from outside, along with the sound of someone choking. At least, that's what it seemed like. I opened the shutter of the window, and then I saw him, lying on the ground. The scythe still in his hand, but next to him. I couldn't distinguish anything else in the dark. I seriously thought about escaping right then. But what if it was all just a trick to lure me outside and catch me more easily? I wasn't going to fall for that. I was going to stick to the plan I had made. So I waited for morning to come. Hour after hour, I looked out the window again, and he was still there. I started to think maybe it wasn't a plan to lure me, and maybe someone had gotten to him before me, or maybe an animal. But if an animal had attacked him, it probably would have dragged the body. Morning finally came, and that's when I saw that all around him there was blood. He was clearly dead. I ran out of the cabin, barely looking at him, and didn't stop running until I reached the car. When I finally got service, I called the police and explained everything that had happened. They went to the cabin and found the man. A few days later, they called me to say that the investigation would end there. The results of the autopsy showed that he had large amounts of drugs in his system and multiple puncture wounds on his body. The simple image made me nauseous. He had died due to the combination of two drugs. That's why he was acting so strange, and that's why he wanted to kill me. Maybe he was hallucinating, and in his head I was a threat. The only thing that doesn't add up is the police telling me that the cabin I was renting was illegal, as was the site I had used. I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, but what's certain is that I'm not getting myself into anything like that again anytime soon. When I was young, we lived in this small town way out in the Appalachian Mountains called Irwin, Tennessee. It was the kind of place that felt cut off from the rest of the world, surrounded by ridges that made the town feel like a bowl you had to climb out of just to see anything else. It might sound exaggerated, but it's the reality. One day my uncle told me that, and the expression just stuck with me because it was exactly how I felt living there. The air always smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, and there wasn't much to do besides walk the tracks or hang out at someone's house after school. The good part, which I notice in contrast to today, is that we really played with each other back then. We didn't stay at home isolated. We were much closer in our friendships. This was early October, probably 2009. I was about 13 or 14 years old. Football season had started. The evenings were getting that sharp little bite in them, and you could smell people burning leaves in their yards. Back then, I didn't have much self-esteem, and so, even though I knew all the kids and played with them, I only felt genuinely comfortable with 2 or 3. One of those friends had a cousin with a property way up near Rock Creek Park, a real old place we were always hearing fascinating stories about. It was one of those farmhouses that looked like it should have collapsed 50 years ago, but somehow hadn't. The kind with sagging floors that moaned under your weight and wallpaper peeling in wide strips. The attic had this heavy iron latch on the door, and the cellar was a dirt hole in the ground, so black you couldn't even imagine the bottom. Even though I spent a lot of time in the house, I never went down there. Still, in daylight, the place worked like a clubhouse for us. That Friday, we decided we'd camp out in the yard, right at the tree line. I know I was very young, and it's strange these days for parents to have that kind of trust in kids. But my parents always let me play freely and make my own mistakes. I don't mean they were careless with me. They weren't. They just trusted me more. So, back to the idea of camping out that night. It felt adventurous, but safe enough. We dragged out an old canvas tent that smelled like mildew, set up a couple of kerosene lanterns, and stacked firewood. Most of the afternoon was spent messing around, throwing a football, daring each other to walk a few steps into the trees. The woods were thick, so thick the light seemed to vanish once you got more than 20 feet in. Even during the day, you felt like you were being swallowed. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridges, we had the fire going strong, and that's when I noticed it. The woods out there were alive with sound. Crickets, frogs, wind, until suddenly, they weren't. This is important because up to that moment, I wasn't conditioned in the way I am today. In other words, now I know that the real problem, when things start going wrong, or when there's a predator nearby, is that the normal sounds of the forest disappear. But, back then, I didn't know that. I was a kid. So, I think the fact that I noticed it and that it scared me was some kind of instinct I didn't even know I had. I mentioned it to my friends, and we laughed it off at first. I think that's a kind of defense mechanism, making jokes about things that scare us, trying in some way to strip away the scary part and replace it with a smile, something light and funny. So we kept playing. We joked about real things like bears and joked about ghosts. But everyone felt the mood shift. I could see it in the way we kept glancing over our shoulders. As we talked about scarier things, the smiles got smaller and less real. Later that night, maybe close to midnight, we were stretched out in our sleeping bags. The fire had burned down to a glow. The lantern threw these weak yellow halos against the tent walls. And that's when I started hearing sticks snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal moving through the brush. Maybe the bear we'd been joking about earlier, and that wasn't funny at all. But after a while, the sounds started coming from different spots. One to the left, one to the right, then a little farther back. Like something circling us in a slow and careful way. My stomach turned to ice, and by the look on my friends' faces, I knew they were feeling exactly the same thing. We knew we weren't as alone as we thought, and we knew it wasn't animals around us. None of us really moved. We were all just waiting for an adult to show up and pull us out of the situation. But after a few seconds, the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. Yet when I listened more closely, I realized the noise hadn't ended. It had just been replaced. No more snapping. Just another sound. A lot softer, like a steady rustle, almost like fabric brushing against bark. Again moving slow, and just far enough back that we couldn't see a thing. Every hair on my arm stood up. I kept picturing someone walking the perimeter, dragging their sleeve along the trees, wanting us to know they were there. We had heard so many stories that the last thing I wanted was to actually be in the middle of one. Then the strangest thing happened. My friend's cousin, the one who lived there, told us to lie down and pretend we were asleep. I don't know how he managed to get 3 panicked teenagers to obey him. But the reality is, we did. The tone of his voice was real fear, and that made us trust that, of all of us, he was the only one who knew what was happening. We didn't talk after that. We didn't even breathe heavy. We just lay there, pretending to be asleep, every muscle in our bodies locked tight. I was so tense my arm went completely numb. At some point, I don't know how long, because in moments of panic, a minute can feel like an hour, and an hour, like a minute. The sound drifted deeper into the woods, and the silence grew. Until finally, we stopped hearing whatever it was, and the noises that had been there before, like the sound of the crickets, came back. That was when my friend's cousin told us to get up, and we all ran inside the house. He explained to us that in that area there was a legend about a spirit that roamed looking for the living to drag them into the forest. The only way to fight it was to pretend you weren't alive. At the time, we all accepted that explanation and just stopped going to his house. So many years later, I know that what probably happened is that some animal, probably a predator, was nearby. Many animals lose interest when you don't react, and that was probably what happened. Rationally, I know it was just an animal, but it was still a terrifying situation, and one that made me believe in ghosts and legends for a long time. I think a part of me has always wondered if the story of the spirit might have some shred of truth, even though rationally I know it doesn't.